And welcome to the Mind Your Career webinar series. My name is Rachel Burkhan-Rammelfinger, and I work with the Career Development team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. I'm delighted to have you all joining us today for our webinar, Resumes That Resonate. The presentation is going to discuss how to capture the attention of A-list organizations. And today's speaker is Pam Schilling. She is a career coach, a CEO, a professor, a speaker, and a mom of 2 twin boys. And she's no stranger to the University of Chicago, having got her MBA at Booth and having worked as a career coach here at the university. When I asked Pam what she wanted to be when she was a child, her career goal, she said she wanted to be an astronaut, and specifically to pilot the space shuttle. But the goal was derailed due to her need to wear glasses and the realization that she would have to take 4 years of calculus in college. But as a runner-up, she has spent 50% of her career traveling, mostly on planes, and so that's a good substitute. Another fun fact is that Pam has 2 4.5-year-old twin sons, who she currently has a French tutor for, and she is attentively listening to their lessons to refresh her own French to use when they travel to the country. It's my pleasure to hand the controls over to Pam.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Rachel, for having me, and thanks to everyone who's attending. Happy New Year. And I think that there's a great deal of interest in this topic because the new year is certainly an opportunity for many professionals to think about their career and where they're headed, and perhaps some future opportunities. So I think we're going to have a great conversation today, and I hope to make it engaging and insightful. So Rachel told you a teeny bit about my background, but I want to lay out a couple things to maybe give all of you some context about why I spend a good bit of my time professionally today working on resumes. So I began my career working in one company for 7 years, but during that time, I actually had 5 different job changes. That was a function of the rapid growth. I was working in the telecommunications industry. I was in a rotational program. And so about every 6 months, I actually had to update my resume. Subsequent to getting my MBA at Chicago, I found myself post the year 2000 in the job place. There were lots of exciting things going on. And over the course of the next 10 years, I actually undertook 6 job changes. So again, lots of time and energy on the resume. So when you put this together, about 20 years of experience and 13 years of job changes, I have probably made thousands of edits on my own resume. And that also means that I've been in your shoes, and I've also been in the place of a lot of my clients. Now, if you kind of read into this, you might also say that I was well prepared to become a career coach eventually. So at a certain point in my career, I realized how much I really was very committed and passionate about coaching and teaching. And so I took a lot of the lessons that I'd learned in my career and applied them to the work that I do today. So I work with a lot of variety in professionals. I'm teaching at a university, and I think a lot deeply about what professional growth looks like, what career advancement looks like, what career change looks like, and how do you package that and market that to future employers. And some of this comes from years of sitting in the seats of being a hiring manager. I worked in the consulting industry. I worked in a number of corporations. I was hiring and interviewing people. When I came back to the University of Chicago to work in MBA Career Services, I got a tremendous amount of insight into what some of the elite hiring organizations are expecting. And then over the last decade of being an independent career advisor, I've probably read thousands of resumes, worked with a variety of different types of professionals, different educational backgrounds, different professional fields, different challenges in their careers. And I think that these have provided a number of invaluable lessons. And so today I want to share some of that with you and bring some of that insight. So for our agenda, I really want to talk about 3 things. So first is I want to go through a little bit of resume wisdom. There's some pitfalls, there's also some trends, and I think it's great to just begin to set context with that element. The next thing I want to talk about are some of the must-haves. These are what I would consider the basics, the foundations of building a strong resume. And then what I want to do in concluding our conversation is talk about that stuff that you can do to help you stand out and how to bring some of those elements into your resume. All right, and as we get started, Rachel, this might be a good point to begin our poll. One of the things that we want to hear a little bit about is what brought everybody here today, and this will help as I make comments along the way. So why don't we launch the first poll.
So on everyone's screen should be what drew you to this webinar today? And your 4 options are, I'm interested in tips to get my resume noticed. B, career transition. C, stalled job search. D, New Year's resolution.
That's great.
And I'll leave this open for about a total of 30 seconds. I see we have 74% of the folks have already voted. So if you could jump in with your votes. All right, we're going to close the poll.
Great.
And our results are 40% of folks are here because they're interested in tips to get their resume noticed. 38% are making a career transition. 16% are in a stalled job search, and 6% New Year's resolution.
Oh, fantastic. Well, in a way, I'm surprised the New Year's resolution is so small, but I think that some of those other reasons probably trump it. And I think we're going to be able to address all of those different interests, particularly for that group that answered the stalled job search. Just one of the things I'll tell you guys very confidently is I've had a lot of experience working with professionals in your situation, and some of these resume changes can make a big difference. So we'll explore all of those. I've got here up on the screen a link to my webpage where I've put some of the materials for this session. If any of you are online and you can access that as well, feel free to bring it up. The PowerPoint that I'm using is there. There's also some resume examples that I'm going to walk through to illustrate some of the different elements that I talk about. And then you'll have access to this after the session as well. So just a couple key takeaways that I want to make sure that you all are aware of by the time we wrap up today. These are the things that I hope that you have a perspective on. So there are definitely myths and facts about resumes, and also the market's changing. There's a lot of things that have stayed the same, but there are definitely some present day trends. One of the things we hear a lot about is to tailor your resume. That's a very broad concept. So one of the things I'm going to do is try to really build some key foundations of what that means and how you can make it matter. And then finally, how to adapt the style of your resume to the search that you're looking for. And that's something that I'm particularly focused on when I work with my clients. All right, so let's start with a couple of pieces of resume wisdom, if you will. And I think one of the things that I believe philosophically is that there's not a one way to do resumes. And a lot of times I tell professionals, if you show your resume to 50 different people, you're probably going to get 50 different comments. This, in fact, is a point that was made by Amy Gallo in a Harvard Business Review article that she wrote a few years ago about how to write resumes that stand out. And her opening line is, the resume. There are so many conflicting recommendations out there. I could not agree with that statement more. And in fact, when I tell all of you some of the things on our webinar today, I will tell you the pros and the cons of different elements. I don't necessarily prescribe a one absolute way. I think there are a lot of different circumstances that drive what goes into a resume and how it's put together. Each one of you is very unique and different, and there are things where, you know, a similar individual compared to someone else, I might propose two different approaches given your circumstance and situation. But that does make it hard for you because you're trying to prioritize your time and focus what you're doing. But I think you want to keep that in mind. So some of the top myths that I think stick out about resumes. So one is that more is more. And that means more content. The more you put in your resume, the more likely you are to resonate with a recruiter or a hiring manager. I think that's actually a myth. A lot of what is emphasized is prioritizing and focusing your content. We're going to talk about that more. Another myth is kind of the one for all and all for one. So one resume, put it together, one style, one approach. And in many situations, you're looking at different kinds of employers and different circumstances and different size organizations, and you might actually need more than one version. It just depends again. Another myth is that a really good resume is going to get you a job. And hopefully everybody understands that the resume is there to get you into the door and to get that interview set up and to lay a foundation for being a strong candidate. Another myth is that, resumes are only being read for 6, 8, 10, 20 seconds. And so, a lot of the things that might, happen in a resume, spelling mistakes, small formatting errors, really are going to get overlooked because you can't possibly see it. The thing is that people that read resumes are very detail oriented, and those errors will stand out, and they'll kind of catch you into a place where you might end up in the no pile. And then another myth is that personal things don't matter. And I think that there are some circumstances where I prescribe not including a lot of personal information, but in other situations, it might be very relevant, and it might help build some characteristics about who you are as a candidate. A few other myths, only including paid positions. I can tell all of you that very, personally in my experience, I transitioned from corporate America into career coaching. And in doing that, I had to put a lot of my volunteer work, a lot of my mentoring in my resume, because that was the formal experience I had in career services. So some of those unpaid positions can be incredibly relevant. Another myth is that any kind of employment gap can be devastating. This is definitely not the case. There's a lot of professionals that have been out of the work environment for a variety of reasons, and employers understand that. They're people too. Part of it is the way that you handle it. An additional myth is that your past represents your future. And so what I mean by that is that sometimes if you're trying to go in a new direction, if you don't change the way that you've presented your background, it looks like you're trying to get a new job in the same field that you've been in. And so your past actually has to modify, or it has to change a little bit to, in fact, represent the new role, the new type of organization, the new industry that you might be going into. In addition, with a referral, some people think that the resume is just a formality. I have found ample circumstances where that wasn't the case, that someone maybe didn't do the due diligence to present a really strong resume, and in fact, their referral was disappointed, and the interview didn't come to be. So, just because you have a referral doesn't mean that the resume is just kind of an administrative item. And then finally, many of us, we understand the hiring process. You've probably been in it yourself. We'd like to think that resumes are completely screened against the hiring requirements of the position, and that sort of connecting to the individual doesn't matter. But there's a lot of research and a lot of evidence that says that there is this similarity evaluation between you and the person reading your resume. And so this idea of kind of liking you as a candidate, it really does matter. All right, you know what, Rachel, why don't we run one of the other polls before we get into a couple of the trends. So I think we have another question that might be great about what's the purpose of the resume. Why don't we take a quick poll on that right now?
Great. So attendees, it's live. What's the purpose of your resume? A, to inventory all of the work you have done. B, to align your background to the needs of the job and the office. C, to demonstrate career progression and problem-solving skills. We're at 20 seconds, and we've had about 60% of you vote. So jump in with these last little bit of time before we close the poll to get your vote in.
Nice.
All right, we'll be closing the poll. And so we can see that Choice A received 1%. Nobody thinks it's to inventory all the work you've done. Choice B at 74% to align your background to the needs of the job and the organization. 25% for C to demonstrate your career progression and problem-solving skills.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, one, I'm very impressed with the thinking of the group, and no surprise. I think this idea of alignment is so important, and to figure out what the organization needs, their challenges, their opportunities. So we're going to continue to probe on that as we progress. So I want to take just a couple minutes and I want to speak to some of the current resume trends. And, there's a lot of things that are being said right now that the resume is actually a thing of the past. Many of you may hear this, that, many organizations are looking at what you have on LinkedIn. There's some mixed signals here. I think that there's still a great deal of evidence that says resumes matter. This is the dominant, approach to evaluating candidates. But I do think that there's some key things that it's helpful if you consider as you're building your resume. So item number one, believe it or not, I'm going to start really basic, is the font that you use. Fonts have changed the way that we write. There's kind of this idea of the cleaner fonts. And there's something to be said about showing that you are progressing with the modern times. Now, which font that is, I'll talk about that soon. But there's definitely some people that have told me, they don't like a Times New Roman font because it feels very old-fashioned. That's an opinion, but these are the kinds of things that people think about. Another trend is having a really clean format. And so there's some things that have been said about infographics and these more stylized resumes. That's actually not the case so much. And if you think about it, many resumes are being read on laptops, sometimes tablets and mobile phones. And so the cleaner it is, the easier it is for someone to actually see your content. What is true is having the LinkedIn URL, so whatever your LinkedIn profile is, as a part of your contact information, actually including that. That's very helpful. Most of the professionals that I know, anytime they get outreach from somebody, they look up your profile on LinkedIn. That just seems to be a standard in this day and age. Another resume trend, and it seems that this would be odd connected to the resume, but it's a little bit true. So some of the things that you all do professionally that are your strengths, your capabilities, your industry expertise, your subject matter expertise, a lot of employers like seeing what your capabilities are demonstrated in some sort of form and fashion on social media. And so within the content of your resume, you can actually present that. So things really simple like writing blog posts, putting posts on LinkedIn. Maybe there's an industry journal that you happen to write for that is out there. We're not talking about the social side of social media. We're talking about it more in a professional context. And then another trend in resumes is to create more visibility into your soft skills. Absolutely, employers want hard skills, but the idea of emotional intelligence, and some of those other soft skills are really important in the hiring process today. So things like your work ethic, dependability, positive attitude, self-motivation, team orientation, those may seem obvious, but those are some of the discerning factors among candidates. And the more you can bring them out in your resume, the better. I mentioned a little bit about graphics. There's some interesting things that we can do nowadays, but that really isn't something that employers want to see in a resume. Now, if you're in a field that is very artistic, advertising, the arts, architecture, those sorts of things, graphic design, that may be important for you. So this is very role specific. One of the big resume trends right now are your technology skills. What kinds of technology are you working with? Now, if you're somebody like me, I don't code, I'm not a programmer. But I certainly use a lot of online technologies. As an academic, I'm using learning management systems. So in my field, in my resume, I emphasize that, and I emphasize the systems and platforms that I know. And so within the context of your role, what are the current trends with technology in your field? And then really demonstrating that you're using those in an applied sense. This is not a new trend, but I think it's always worth emphasizing is to show the value that you've brought to the organizations that you've been a part of. And again, this is paid positions as well as some of the volunteer work that you're doing. One of the areas, by the way, of debate in resumes is the concept of a professional summary that sits at the top of your resume. So keep that in mind. Some people really like it, some people don't. And then finally, very much you want to avoid what's out. So objective statements are no longer a part of resumes, references. And then one of the other things that I read was, kind of old school email addresses. And I don't know if I agree with this, but using your university email is a little bit of a debate if you've been working for a while. But some of the older kind of email platforms, some people, I think, look at that and say, well, maybe this person isn't quite as modern as we might be looking for. That's something, again, that I don't know. I never tell people to change their email address, but if you're in a position where you want to set up an email just for your job search, that also can make sense. So something I think to keep in mind as we, begin to progress out of some of the specific areas, when you think about your resume, there's a great deal of research and practical assessment that says you can build a better resume. You can't go back and change your career history. You can't change the schools, the grades, the employers, the positions, the titles, but you can put that information together in better context. And so I think that's what I want to talk about next is how we do that. All right, so I'm going to transition to the next area of our must-haves and introduce kind of a couple of different things to really be thinking about. So just to establish a little bit of why I view these as must-haves, a lot of times when I'm working with professionals on their resume, one of the very first questions I get is, what should my resume look like? And I think that's a great question, and it's a very, very good discussion to have. And it very much depends on where you're heading. And one of the questions usually I get is, well, how many pages should my resume be? There's a lot that says it should be 1 page, 2 pages, many pages. And believe it or not, that's actually, I think, a very important kind of beginning place. So let me offer you a couple of points of guidelines here. So for people that have the focus on a 1-page resume, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. So if you have less than 10 years of experience, 1 page makes sense. It's also a valuable thing when you're networking because it's a much easier snapshot of your background. It's also great if you're looking at non-traditional organizations. And by that, I mean startups, could be some nonprofits, could be family-owned businesses. So outside of the traditional corporate environment or a higher education environment, a research institution, a 1-page resume can really present your candidacy very nicely. I think it's also great for career changers because you can be a little bit more creative in packaging your background. And there's also a lot of things from your background that may not quite fit into the relevant skills. So it's a nice way to put together just the most salient points. And then in general, I recommend that all professionals have one version that's a 1-page. And you can do this in a variety of ways. There's a 2-column format and also a sort of snapshot. On the web page that I put together for all of you, I've given you a couple of examples of those, and they just don't look so standard and typical. And that could be a nice alternative to the traditional resume, and also good from a networking perspective. In the world of 2-page, that's the most typical, and probably most of you have a 2-page resume. If you have more than 10 years of experience, it makes sense. If you're someone who is a consultant or you've done a lot of project work or a lot of research, if you are doing this, you want to make sure that what's on your first page is the most critical content to kind of see who you are today. Make sure you keep a lot of white space because when we go to 2 pages, we tend to want to layer a lot of information. And you can organize the sections differently, and we're going to talk about that shortly. And this is sort of the standard in many, many different fields. But there's also some alternatives. And again, I've given all of you a couple of examples of this. I have a kind of a one-page resume that then has an addendum with some project examples or some more functional skills, because today snapshot and then have a second page with projects on it. There's also
Pam, we lost your sound for a second there.
Oh,
if you could
is
go
that okay?
back and repeat a little bit. Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So for the 2-page, you can do a traditional 2-page, which is chronological. But then there's also some alternatives that I've given to you, where the first alternative is kind of a 1-page where you've got all of your employers, and then the second page is an addendum with specific projects. And the idea is to combine the idea of a chronological and a functional. The other alternative is what I call a CV resume hybrid. There's a lot of professionals that maybe have worked in research fields or academia, medicine, law, and the CV kind of resonates with certain employers. But in business roles, they like more of the resume. And so I've got kind of a way to do a little bit of a hybrid of those two. So the point of it is, not all 2-page resumes have to look exactly the same way. You can kind of tailor them a little bit to the kind of roles that you're seeking and what your background is. All right. And then the third structure is kind of the many page. And some of you may find yourself in a situation where, for a very specific reason, you need to have multiple pages. I think, my point of view is, unless you happen to be in a field where you need multiple pages, I would default to a 2-page. But for people in academia, in research, sometimes in the arts where you have long project histories, multiple pages is going to make sense. And it's always good to kind of see what's normal for the organization. I've had some clients who've looked at administrative roles within higher ed, and they've sort of had to decide whether a CV or a resume made sense. There's also people in international settings where a resume in the United States is very different internationally. And so, there are different norms and things that are typical. So you really want to think about that. And then some of you may be interested in doing things, maybe you're working in a field and you want to go teach in an educational environment at a university as an adjunct professor. And it's kind of nice to be able to take whatever your typical 2-page resume is and create an academic CV. So having familiarity with those things can really make a difference. What employers ultimately take away is that you've tailored what you're doing very specifically to their hiring process and their enterprise or organizational identity. All right, so you know what, Rachel, let's do a quick poll before I move on. So maybe let's ask about some of the challenges.
All right, the poll should be in front of you. Attendees, where do you find challenges in preparing your resume? A, I find it difficult to remember all the work and projects I've done. B, it is challenging to be concise in my presentation. C, it is hard to select what should not be included. And thank you for those who've already been filling it out. If we give it like 7 more seconds.
Awesome.
All right, we're going to close the poll now. Thank you all so much. And you all should be able to see these results. That A, I find it difficult to remember all of the work and projects I've done. That was 6%. B, it's challenging to be concise in my presentation, 36%. C, it's hard to select what should or should not be included, 59% selected that.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about that actually coming right up. So I'm glad that that's kind of the piece that stood out, because I do think that that's something that a lot of professionals struggle with. So I'm not going to talk a ton about what's on the next slide, but in terms of format, my bottom line is keep things simple, be thoughtful about your formatting, how you're including content, the verbs that you use, the language that you use. One of the documents that I've put for you on the web page is a list of verbs, believe it or not, to kind of provide a snapshot of what could be useful in resumes. We're going to talk a little bit more about tailoring, and then just being really conscientious about the details. I have a quick thing that I do with resumes is I read them kind of bottom to top and right to left. And sometimes in doing that, it helps me catch some of the spelling mistakes that I've made or some of the grammar, and also just being really consistent about how you're formatting. So simple things like that will make the way that you package just sizzle. That's what we're trying to do. All right, so a couple of comments about the sections. As you all probably know, a resume typically has 3 sections, could have 4, could have 5, depending on your circumstance. How we include those sections and where we place them depends a little bit on your circumstance. You know, education, whether you put it at the top or the bottom, depends a lot on your background. What you include in terms of training and certifications, again, it depends on who you are. And I think the other thing to think about is the amount of education. I've met a number of professionals, kind of later stage career professionals, for their enjoyment and growth. They're going back and getting master's degrees. Think about where you put that, and is it really part of your professional footprint, and how much do you want to showcase it? And the great way to determine that is by getting feedback. The experience has some interesting, I think, aspects to it. You know, most of the time we think about professional experience, but we all may have volunteer experience. If you're a career changer, you may have experience in 2 different fields. So for example, my resume, I have experience in consulting in corporate America, and then I have experience in higher education. And I actually separate those 2 in my resume because I want to highlight them. And then finally, you're going to have these other sections. You know, it could be called additional, it could be called professional affiliation, it could be called volunteer or community activity. Again, think about what makes sense for who you are and what is this professional kind of personality that you want to convey. I do a great deal of volunteer work in the career coaching space, so of course I include that on my resume because I want people to know that I do that. You know, I do this more than just on a kind of professional basis. But I also have some affiliations that are, for example, at my kids' school and the kind of volunteer work that I do. And I think I do that because I want people to know that I'm a parent. I have a lot of things on my plate. I'm really good at multitasking, right? So that's where those personal things come into play. And it just depends on the circumstance. The other thing that you guys can think about in your resume are these optional sections. And, you know, what makes sense? What's the role? What's the positioning? And this comes down to that question of how do you select? How do you prioritize? For some people, a professional summary makes sense. For some people, it isn't necessary. With my clients, we have that discussion and really try to think about what they want to say. If you're a career changer, sometimes that can be helpful. Also, sometimes it's nice to call out your accomplishments. You know, for people who have very metrics-oriented roles, for executives, for people in sales, those sorts of things, accomplishments are great. And then also, if you're a career changer, they can be really valuable just to stand out. A skills summary is something else that some people include. Again, it just depends on the nature of your roles. Sometimes people have sections of training and certification very specifically to call that out. In certain fields, publications and presentations are very crucial, and same with awards. So you can add those sections. You know, the key is to really think about how much of that information is necessary, and then how does it flow, because remember, your resume is trying to convey a story. And then within it, how do you select the most relevant and salient points? So the takeaway from that and kind of leading into the next must-have is this idea of priorities. And so a couple of things that I want to plant in your thinking. One is that less is more. And the second is that you do have to prioritize the content. You can't have everything. And many of you said that. You realize this is not a full inventory. So the question is, how do we prioritize? And I want to give you a little bit of a rubric or a set of criteria to think about. So when I sit down with somebody and looking at their resume, we have this kind of bullet bake-off, if you will. What bullets get into the resume and which ones get deleted? And I use overall three big criteria. So number one, does the information convey targeted skills and capabilities to the role that you're pursuing? Number two, does it show a clear impact that you've made for the organization? And then number three, does it make you stand out? Are you a professional rock star? And that may sound a little bit crazy, but at the end of the day, as a hiring manager, I want to hire superstars. I want to hire people that I can brag about. I want people who've done great things. So in doing this, you can think about your background and ask yourself a set of questions. The information that I'm including, is it the greatest impact of all the projects I've worked on, all the things that I've done, all of the thinking that I've done, all the research that I've worked on, all the cases that I've been a part of, the ones that I'm presenting, are these the biggest impact? And however you define impact. Secondly, is it pertinent to the new role and organization, right? Because you're looking at the future. So there are things in the past, like I was a financial analyst. I don't build financial models anymore. So I don't have a lot of that in my resume. I may have just a smattering for credentialing, but 10, 15 years ago, I had a lot of that. For what I do now, it's not as relevant. Third, do you show clear results? And quantitatively is best. And so if it's hard to quantify, you can either think creatively or it might not make sense. Does it show your leadership, whether as a team leader or individually? Another question I often ask is, does it have an element of drama? Was what you did super hard? Was it, kind of in a crazy environment? Did you have to work under really, interesting circumstances? Because that's something that, employers like to see, because that character is going to come forward in the work that you're going to do for them. Another question is about adding breadth and variety of experience. So are you trying to present depth in an area, or are you trying to show a broad set of skills? And that's a question. And then finally, when you put all of your information together, do the pieces connect to tell a story? So I told you guys about my background and all these different job changes. There's two threads in every role that I've had. One was I was always recruiting, and number two, I was always training and teaching. So even though I've had all these different job titles in different industries and different companies, you can see that thread throughout my entire background. So I think that's something to keep in mind. All right, so what I want to do now is cover our last area, which is the stuff that's going to make you stand out. So to this point, we've thought about formatting and packaging, thinking about how do we prioritize what's in, what's out. Now I want to go kind of the last mile. So if you think about the employment environment today and searching in all of your circumstances, and many of you may be in hiring positions, an employer might get multiple hundred resumes for a position. Another circumstance is that some of the elite employers, everybody that they get is super talented and super credentialed. So how do you stand out in those circumstances? And this is where, back to that quote, you definitely can think about how you present. So I'm going to talk about three things here that I think are important. So the first is context. And this is one of the things that I find is often missing in resumes, and it's hard to do. So context is the thing that helps you build the story. So this is the circumstances of your background. And I'm going to illustrate this by way of an example, and it's going to be a little bit quirky, so bear with me. So one of the things that I'm going to show you is a selfie, right? Selfies are very popular these days. And this is a picture of me, and I'm on vacation, and you can see my face, and you can look at it and ask yourself, what do you notice? What are some of the details, right? It's a very focused, very close in picture. Do you know what I'm doing? Do you know where I am? Do you know the broader setting of what caused me to have this picture taken? Well, it's a simple, example, but it may not give you the full context of the setting and the importance of this setting. So if instead I'd started out by presenting this picture to you, if I showed you this first, which has a wider lens, it creates maybe a grander scale of the setting or the context, right? And just for fun and interest, this is one of the trips I took last summer, and something that was really personal and special to me, because this is actually in the French Alps at the top of Mont Blanc. And it's a place I'd always wanted to go for whatever reason, and it was breathtaking, right? So if I think about this in the environment of resumes, to be able to tell somebody the importance, the meaning, the magnitude, and then give them some of the details that I was able to, by way of some trams and gondolas, make it to 14,000 feet, which I think is the height of Mont Blanc. That was a very special personal accomplishment, right? So if you put that then in the context of the business environment. So where do you look for context? This is in the environment that all of you have worked in. You've worked in pressured situations. You've worked in organizations that have had turnover, reduced budgets, high rates of growth, trying to be transformative, new products, creating new things, leadership changes. All of these different circumstances of your background create context. And the hiring managers, and the way that you can demonstrate value is by showing them the context that you've been a part of and creating that alignment with the organization. So here's a very simple example of setting context. So this resume bullet says this was the 8th person to join a now 178 person manufacturer, whatever industry. And so I know that this person started early and went probably through a very tumultuous, crazy time of growth for the organization. And that those simple pieces of information give me context. All right, so that's something to think about in how you shape your content. The next area that helps you stand out, and this is probably obvious, but I want to emphasize it, results show your value. We know that employers want to hire people that create value, right? So here's a set of bullets that I often see in resumes, and they're very task oriented, managing a team, creating forecasts, presenting new initiatives. They're kind of the things that you did. If you add to that then the results, the quantifiable results, then your resume just sings. And if you're listening to me and you think this is so obvious, I know this, I agree with you. But I would say 80% of the resumes that I start out working are lacking these results. They're also often qualitative, which I'm okay with, but if you can push to be more quantitative, it really, really stands out. And that's where some of your thinking should be placed. And an example of that, this is a person who worked in a university environment that acquired a new library. They wrote a grant. That grant resulted in recognition as the largest collection in the world. So there's a quantitative element, and then there's a quasi-quantitative element. But adding those pieces rather than just saying, I did this and it turned out great, can make a big difference. All right, the last thing I'm going to cover, and then we're going to pause for some questions, is this idea of fit. So you are going to be assessed based on your fit with the hiring organization. Fit in your resume is what gets you the interview. How do I define fit and how do I get there? So how I get there is you doing research, tailoring your resume, and then really aligning to the organization. That's everything that we've talked about to this point. How does fit get assessed? Well, it's based on 4 things. Your fit with the job, your fit with the organization, your fit with the organization's environment, and then your fit with the person hiring or the person reading your resume. And so what do those things mean? I mean, the job is probably most obvious because of the skills. The organization, its culture, its values, its goals. And by the way, people will read your resume and look at experiences and look at your academic backgrounds and look at your volunteer experience in your organizations to help them gauge that. There's also the environment that that company is in, their phase of development. There's a lot of stress triggers in organizations, and so they want to know if you can handle that based on role ambiguity, the scope of the role, latitude, decision making, those sorts of things. And so your content can help them assess that. And then finally, that person reading your resume, they have a view of an ideal employee. And they're trying to look for similar characteristics between you and them. And so some of those connections, like your academic backgrounds, the professional organizations, the volunteer organizations you're a part of, play into that. And you can't exactly control that, but it does show you the importance of some of those elements. The final thing I'm going to say about alignment is you really want to think about the stage of development that the organization is in. And if you're someone who spent a lot of time in, mature organizations or, growing organizations, and you're kind of trying to switch to a different place in the life cycle, your experience needs to show your capabilities. I've worked in a lot of organizations that were in decline, and so I have a lot of that background. I haven't worked as much in startup organizations, so people are always a little bit skeptical. And being able to talk to those organizations and use their language and just change up maybe your focus can help you create that alignment much better. All right, so just in closing, I want to offer a couple of just remarks, and then we'll prepare to have some questions. So there's a few things that, I think you can definitely do to stand out. I've listed a few of them there. There's a few things on here that I'm just going to highlight. You want to be comfortable being awesome. This hiring process, we want to be humble and we want to be team players, but you should be very proud of your professional accomplishments. You should read your resume and look at it and say, my gosh, this professional's awesome. And I'm very objective about being able to say that because of what you've been able to bring out. All right. So Rachel, I think this is a great time to take some questions.
Wonderful. We do have a bunch that have come in. I would say, let's see, one quick one to start was, is it a good idea to have a professional picture on your resume?
My view, if you're interviewing in the United States, absolutely not. It will be a problem for many organizations. Now, if you are looking at things internationally, some of those rules are different. But I will admit this is a little bit strange, given that it is expected that you have a picture on LinkedIn. Because when you don't have a picture, your profile is a little bit mysterious. But because of the nature of a lot of the labor laws and issues with discrimination, most employers do not want you to have a picture on your resume.
And that we had a follow-up question, is it necessary to have a LinkedIn profile?
Good question. My personal opinion, again, is yes. It credentials you in another way. I think aside from the resume, there are a lot of professional circumstances where you won't send a resume, but yet someone wants to see your background. And many people that I speak with will tell me anytime they reach out to somebody, they instantly know that they're checking their LinkedIn profile. I just feel like in this day and age, it's appropriate. It doesn't take a lot of time. It can be sort of a passive activity, but I feel like it's only to your benefit. There aren't too many downsides, and you can keep it simple.
Great. So how do we speak about a gap in experience? And then this person provided context, but a couple other folks were asking a similar question. This context is, I quit my job 2 months ago after being at a company for 7 years, my first job after graduating from the University of Chicago. I'm looking for tips from both talking about it generally in an interview and more specifically in terms of putting down a 10-year end date on my resume. I left on good terms, but the compensation was not commensurate
that a gap is handled. So in your resume, if you quit your job 2 months ago, it takes 5 seconds to go into your resume and put an end date, but you also don't have to. Nobody's sort of expecting that you're updating your resume every 5 minutes. But at some point, somebody's going to want to know what your employment situation is. My view generally is to be direct. I always encourage my clients, put your end date in your resume. People need to know that you're not working. They don't like things kind of disguised because it questions a pinch of your integrity. And then you want to present what the situation is. And you want to do it in a way that is positive in terms of your professional motivation, but not negative in terms of your dissatisfaction with your previous role or organization. I'll give you guys a few examples. A client of mine was working for a company outside the United States. They called him one day and said, "We would like you to relocate back to our headquarters." And he simply, for personal reasons, did not. And he resigned and, put that in his resume. And then every organization that he spoke to, he said, I had a great employment situation. I really love my organization, but I just wasn't willing to relocate back to our headquarters. I really want to establish my footprint here. Another colleague of mine was working for kind of an e-commerce tech company in a product management role. He was uncomfortable with the just development he was getting professionally and sort of his growth. And so he took a sabbatical. He wanted to take a clean break. He wanted to explore what area of technology that he wanted to work in. He wanted the flexibility to do a lot of networking and reflection, and he felt he couldn't do that being employed full-time. And then when he would talk to organizations, he would simply say, I just wanted a kind of a new take where I was heading professionally, and I felt that I couldn't commit to my job with the level that was necessary for my organization, as well as, explore the next stage in my career. So, employers understand these circumstances. I will also say that some people will get it and some people won't. And that's okay, because there's plenty of people that will understand that. And I did that. I quit consulting. I took a 4-month sabbatical. I had some organizations that, I would talk to, and that was a deal breaker because they didn't understand why I wasn't employed. And then I talked to a ton of people that were like, "Oh my gosh, I wish I could do what you're doing." So that's okay. The summary of that is, I believe that, the direct approach is best. Don't try to disguise it in your resume. But the final thing I would say in your resume is, if you're doing something in this period, whether it's volunteer work or traveling or remodeling your home or, painting a masterpiece, those are maybe things that you could include in like an additional section in your resume to kind of speak to how you're applying yourself in that time period.
Great, that's really helpful. What are your thoughts on bulleted lists of generic skills, i.e. writing, editing, facilitation? The person says, "I see this a lot on resumes, but I'm not sure I see the value." Do employers look at a list like that and see a list like that as a substantially conveying skills, or does it just come off as fluff?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't like lists of generic skills. I am okay with lists of specific skills. So I'm working with someone who's in the corporate development space. Their breadth of skills are very important to the hiring organizations. I've worked with someone who was in a business development / R&D role. And so their skills were actually very technical, very specialized, and very unique. I've worked with attorneys that practice in a certain area of law. So I find that those lists can be useful when they are specialized. I will also tell you the second reason that I can be okay with those lists is sometimes it's for cosmetic reasons. that we're doing a 2-page resume, and on page, we don't want things to kind of break on pages. And so to get a position clearly on the second page, I may add some content at the top to fill out page 1. But then there's a lot of thought that goes into what are those lists of skills. So it depends a little on your field. It depends a little on the purpose. But I wouldn't make them generic because, again, you're trying to present your value to an employer, and generic skills are not valued.
We have a bunch of questions about the automated tracking systems that are used. And so I'm going to try to summarize them. Should we be using a different resume format for those websites? If we already know that they're going to run our resume through in ATS, should we keep it to the 1 page? What other advice do you have about using keywords and getting your resume noticed by those automated tracking systems?
Yeah. Wow, that's probably a topic for a webinar in and of itself. So I'm going to speak to you guys from my point of view. So one thing I would venture to say that few of your opportunities are going to come from a situation where you're putting your resume into a website that then's being filtered by an ATS system. So kind of keep that in mind. And I say that because there's a statistic that says jobs over, so some of you this may not be relevant, but high skill jobs over $100,000 a year, 95% of those are hired through relationships and networking. But if you find yourself in that circumstance, I don't think it matters whether you use a 1-page or a 2-page. I don't think the format that you use matters. And if you're always keeping a simple format anyway, it shouldn't matter. Now, some organizations through their website, they want you to like paste text. Then you kind of have to have a resume format where you copy paste very simply. But those systems are really looking for keywords. So, the takeaway is have your resume in a way that the format is very simple and very straightforward. Make sure that you have really strong keywords that are matching to the position. But I don't think a 1-page versus a 2-page necessarily matters. But I can also give you a little tip. One of the things that I do is I have a inventory of a lot of my projects that I just keep in a Word document that's very unformatted, that's written in bullets. And so sometimes when I run into a situation like that, I sort of cobble together resume content, but I'm not necessarily formatting it. So be thoughtful, because the circumstances today almost dictate that you have 1, 2, maybe even 3 formats of your resume. And that's just a natural circumstance of the differences among employers and how they are extracting your resume.
Great, thank you so much. So we're at 12:59, and Pam, I want to ask you one final question as we end, which is, what do you wish your younger self had known?
Oh, wow. I think I'm not going to relate this exactly to my resume. I think I'm going to just be a little bit more macro. I think where you are today professionally doesn't necessarily relate to where you're going to be in the future. The professional career path is a very interesting and scenic journey. But at the same time, all the things that I did, even at the undergraduate level, have shaped who I am today professionally. And so embrace experiences. I wish that I hadn't spent so much time trying to do all the right things because I thought they would build my resume comment. I wish that I had done more of what I loved doing. And at a certain point when I realized that, I started doing a lot more of that. And I actually feel very fortunate professionally because I am in a place where I love the work that I do. I feel a great sense of fulfillment and contribution and alignment to my values, and where I want to impact the world around me and in my own way. And I never thought about that when I was younger. I just wanted to progress and feel fulfillment at an ego level. So that's maybe a long answer, but wherever you are, you're going to be going someplace potentially that could be really special, and just have faith in that.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for participating. And again, a special thank you to Pam for this informative and engaging presentation. I know we had many questions we didn't get to answer, but it's just because it's such an engaging topic. I hope you'll join us again, those of you that are listening in. We have a flurry of online activity happening this month and next. We'll be talking about difficult conversations on January 31st. And in February, our theme is going to be change and career transitions. We're also going to be offering live resume reviews in the future, and so I hope you'll keep a lookout for that. Thank you all so much again for attending, and we'll send you an email with this recording and upcoming events. Have a great rest of your afternoon.